I was asked to say a few words yesterday at a graveside funeral of a man that I'd never met. This happens from time to time, someone that maybe hasn't lived in Brownwood in decades but grew up in this church. And he had not lived in Brownwood since the beginning of World War II. And he was born in 1920, and he was just a few weeks shy of being 101 years old. His name was Philip Shaw, and it's always an honor as a pastor to get invited into that space just to say a few words at a graveside. But he was a veteran of World War II. He graduated from high school in 1937 at the age of 16 and enrolled at Howard Payne, and then the war broke out, and he enlisted in the Air Force, and he was well decorated and then had a military career. So he had not lived in Brownwood since 1941 or 42. But his family has a plot here, and he wanted to be buried with his parents and all of that. So it was full military honors and about 25 family members who attended the funeral the day before in Austin and then came here for the graveside. And then today is my mother-in-law's 90th birthday. And so I've kind of had this weekend of this theme of just, Lord, number my days. Teach me to number my days. Make them count. And I just want to remind us all it's important to saddle up and ride. So if you're sitting on the sidelines waiting for somebody to give you an invitation to really get in the game spiritually or in your community or with your family, or maybe someday I'll make a difference. No, how about today? I mean, your days are numbered, and I stood, and I just want to tell you that legacy is a real thing. That we all leave a legacy. I stood beside grandsons who told stories about their grandfather yesterday at the cemetery at Greenleaf. And like one of the things they told me was that Mr. Shaw, still at the age of 96, was still playing some golf. Just how active that he stayed. He had a second career, which he went back to graduate school in the 60s after a military career, and got a graduate degree from University of Texas, and he was a goldsmith and a sculptor, and he, somewhere early in the days of James Avery, became friends with James Avery and designed some of his early designs. And then on the list goes. I've never read an obituary quite like that. So I just want to remind all of us, there'll be a day for all of us when somebody will be standing by our grave. I know that's a little morbid, but we need to remember our days count, how we live, how we treat people, what we value, what we invest our time in, how we treat our family. All of that matters. And so as I'm a part of a birthday of a 90-year-old and a funeral of somebody almost 101, that gets my heart going in that direction a little bit. So I want to begin today talking about the other end of life, and that's the beginning of life. I have never been to a gender reveal party. Raise your hand if you've ever been to a gender reveal party or gender reveal event. Okay, I've missed out. So somebody invite me to one so I can come get in on the mat. There's a whole industry behind gender reveals. Have y'all noticed that? I mean, it's gotten out of control. So I have a few pictures I want to put about gender reveals. So look at this. 25 unique gender reveal ideas, right? So people there's all kinds of things you can do, right? So let's go to the next slide. The cake is one. Are we going to cut it open? Is it going to be pink or blue? It's making me crazy, the drama, waiting for this. I love this one, the little, he or she's got pink shoes, blue shoes. Cut the cake open, then we'll know if it's a boy or a girl, and we can celebrate. Next slide. The smoke. I didn't know about the smoke was such a big thing. There was a forest fire that burnt. You may have heard of the forest fire that was started by gender reveal smoke in California a year or two ago, and it was a real problem. So pink or blue smoke, get the other kids involved too. And then I think there's one more slide. Is there one more? This is my favorite. Now, I didn't read about this. I just saw the picture. And so I assume that they have a wrestling match, and whoever wins, the guy in the pink tutu or the guy in the blue tutu, that reveals the gender of the child. I still remember the day when you just had to wait till the baby was born. The doctor went, you got a boy. That's when you found out the gender has been revealed. Now, when I read a little bit online, they can find out around 10 weeks. At the beginning of the second trimester, there are tests now where they can determine the gender or the sex of the child. I'm amazed at that, how early you can figure that out, right? But there are websites that abound on advice on how to throw the proper gender reveal party, right? I remember with our first child, sitting in the room, they go, "Do you want to know?" Like, because they didn't tell us, "Hey, we're going to do this." It was the sonogram, and they said, "Well, we have a good picture. We can tell you right now if you want to know, but we don't want to tell you unless you want to know." And they're like, "Okay, we want to know." And they said it's a boy. So, the gender reveal thing is a big, big deal. What I want to tell you today is that God also did a gender reveal. He didn't have you cut into a cake or burn smoke or all these other things that people do. But he made an announcement through a prophet by the name of Isaiah. And check this out. He did it a little earlier than most people do. 700 years before Jesus was born, he was prophesied that there would be a child that would be born, who would be of the Messiah, and that it would be a son. Just an announcement, but it wasn't when Mary was pregnant, right? It wasn't in the doctor's office. There wasn't any smoke or cake. It was the Father proclaiming that one day a child would be born and his name would be called Emmanuel. Commentaries talk about it like this. They tell us that the book of Isaiah has more to say about the coming of the Messiah than any other prophetic book. There's more content predicting and encouraging God's people that one day a child will be born, a Messiah would come. The prophet's heart seems to beat, it says in this commentary, with letting God's people know about the hope of the one who is to come, of a promised birth that will change everything. And so we come today in our series on the prophets to the book of Isaiah again, and we come to scriptures where part of it, when you read it, you're going to think, it's not Christmas time. Why are we reading this? It's because this is what we read during Advent. For unto us a child is born, a son is given. But it's some of the verses around that to me capture this incredible gender reveal that God did 700 years before his son would come. And here's the question I think we have to ask. What were the main themes that are contained in these messianic prophecies? What were the ideas that were central to what God was saying through a prophet hundreds of years before his son was born? And maybe more importantly, how do those ideas connect to us today? So let's read our scripture today. This is Isaiah chapter 9, beginning in verse 2. And you'll recognize the text. The people who walked in darkness, who have seen a great light, those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. They rejoice before you according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle and garments rolled in blood will be used for burning and fuel of fire. For unto us, here it is, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. All right. And then it says, where'd we end up? Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. And upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts perform this. So I want to begin by saying this. This is not one of the main points, but the context, chapter 8, right before this, and then even at the beginning, it tells us the people who have walked in darkness. Okay, the people who have walked in darkness. One of the things that I think is true always is that contrast helps us get perspective. We really don't appreciate good days till we've had a few bad ones, right? You have a few bad ones in a row, and then you get to a good one, you're like, oh, thank goodness, finally a good day. I've had 3 bad ones, right? Contrast is what helps us. You really don't appreciate having money in your bank account till you've been broke. Anybody been broke before? Anybody worried about paying an electric bill? It's a whole lot better when there's money in the account. But you probably don't really appreciate that there's money in the account for all of your bills until you've been in a position where you were wondering if you're going to have enough money to keep the lights on or buy milk and diapers. And I've been in that line as well. See, so contrast helps us. So part of what happens here is God is saying contrast. The people who have been walking in darkness, God's people have been beaten down by an oppressive army, and the whole nation of Israel is suffering through a dark period. And in that context, God chooses to say to them, hey, check it out. 700 years from now. I mean, they didn't tell them that, right? They didn't know that part. But he told them there's going to be a day when a child is born, and he will be the one whose government will never end. He's the Messiah. So recognize the contrast. But here's point number one. Prophecy, just in general, is something that helps us touch the future, right, in order to give us strength for the present. Prophecy allows us to touch the future, and we touch the future by faith. We know it's out there. A better day is coming. You're in darkness now, but one day a light is going to dawn, and his name is Emmanuel, and of the increase of his government there shall be no end. I mean, that was touching, way into the future, but it allowed them. Now, we do this in the natural all the time, right? We do this in the natural all the time. We come to places where we understand, right, that we are people who sometimes have to live through a current situation in order to get to better times. Now, how many times do we fail to applaud the efforts of a student who's dedicated in high school or college or wherever? And that student forgoes a chance to go hang out with their friends and go to the latest party and do whatever, and makes one more trip to the library because they are dedicated to making the highest GPA possible because they want to go to graduate school. And they are making sacrifices in the present because of what? A promised future that's better. A better job because of a better degree, a better opportunity. They're dreaming of better things, and because they're touching that already in their mind, they're willing to go through the present. I talked with Coach Mauser a little bit before the service. I know football practices start tomorrow. I know band probably starts, volleyball starts. So we have all these athletes coming back early. I remember back in the day when you would say to an athlete, you're a sophomore, and ahead of you is a senior in your position. And if we put you on varsity, which you're good enough to be on varsity, you could definitely play right now. But there's a guy ahead of you, or a gal ahead of you, that has earned that spot. And if we put you on varsity, you're going to ride the bench most of the year. We would rather you spend the year on JV. Right, coaches? So that situation happens. And you pay your dues on JV. And you go through getting beat up in practice by varsity players. And you go through playing on Thursday nights instead of Friday nights. But why? What for? Because we say, if you will do this, you will get a lot more reps and a lot more practice, and you're going to be much more prepared as a junior to put on the varsity jersey and step on the field on Friday night. We ask people all the time to postpone satisfaction and make sacrifices in the here and now to go there. I want to remind you that the spirit of prophecy in general is exactly like that. It allows us to touch, to come in contact with what is coming in the future, and it allows us to have strength in the present. A guy was praying for me one time years ago, and I was not pastoring or preaching. I would fill in every once in a while, and he was talking to me, and he said something like this. He said, you are not yet in the fullness of the ministry that the Lord's called you to, but it's going to come. But you have been rejoicing in those things that you've been realizing thus far, and this makes God happy, or something like that. He said, but you're not yet. You're not yet in the fullness of what will come for you one day. But you're rejoicing in what you're experiencing right now. And the fullness will come. It'll be like when your wife gave birth unto children. That's what he said. And so I just tell you from a personal standpoint, that sometimes what we need is not just, hey, gut it up and do what you need to in the present. But what we need is some sense of, why am I doing what am I doing right now? These sacrifices I'm making here in the present, what are they going to matter 10 years from now? And that's when we can say to people, listen, better days are coming. That house that you bought, that little house that you're having to work on, and the yard's not big enough, and it doesn't have enough bedrooms, and the kitchen's not what you want, if you'll sacrifice and remodel that one and take care of it and do what you can within your budget, one day you'll what? You'll get to move to a bigger house. I mean, it's a part of our vernacular. It needs to be a part of also our spiritual vernacular. So, I love this scripture. I think it's in Romans where it says that God calls those things that be not as though they already are. See, David's a shepherd boy, right? Samuel tries to anoint all of his brothers. And Samuel gets to the end. The Lord told him, go anoint somebody in the house of Jesse. And one of those sons is the king. And all these brothers come by. And Samuel goes, are there any others? They go, oh yeah, I mean the youngest, he's a teenager. He doesn't know come here from Sikkim, but he's out there watching sheep. You know, well, go get him. We're not even going to sit down until he gets here. So the prophet makes them wait. They stand there, and I don't know how far they had to go or how long it took, but it took a little bit. They bring David. He's the youngest, you know, because Jesse says, yes, there remaineth yet the youngest. So they bring him, and what does he say to him? He anoints him to be king. He's 16 years old. He can be king yet. There already is a king. But he says that God is putting an anointing on your life that one day will come into fruition. So David lives for a number of years of his life with what in his heart and what in his mind. He's already king in his heart, but he's not yet king in his circumstance. Some of you, one of the things that you need to hear today is this, is that who you are and what you're supposed to become, you already can do it in your mind and do it in your heart, but it's not yet true in the physical. And I say to you, hang on. That's when God gives birth to stuff. There's a gestation period, right? I had a friend that once used to say this. Do you know the gestation period of a field mouse? It's something like 36 hours. Do you know the gestation period of an elephant? 22 months. So the size of what you're giving birth to has a lot to do with how long you're going to be pregnant with it. And we're pregnant sometimes like, I already know this. I know this about myself. I know I'm supposed to run a business. I know I'm supposed to not be working in the office, but be the CEO of the company. I already know. I know it. But it's not yet true. Think of David. He knew he was king long before he was actually king. And it's got to come true like that for us too. So I just want to remind you, God calls those things that be not as though they already are. And He speaks those into our eyes and our lives. Number two, the coming of His Son brings to us increase. I want to remind you, I loved in one commentary it said this, that image is heaped upon image. So part of what happens in the world of the prophetic is that there are images, right? Those who have been in darkness have seen a great light, right? So that's an image. Check this out, this image of increase. I want to remind you that the God that we serve is the God of increase. He brings increase to our lives, increase our faith, increase our numbers, increase our finances, increase our influence. God, when He comes, brings to us influence. But look at all the images, those who've walked through the land of the shadow of death. But then here's the increase. The joy of harvest. What is harvest about? It's when the crop has increased to its full potential, and then we harvest the fruits of the crop. That's a picture of increase. And then it says what? And of the increase of His government, there shall be no end. I mean, it's increase upon increase upon increase. And there's sort of a visual experience in walking through those images. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. And so I just want to remind you that increase is a kingdom focus. I want to remind you today a little bit that part of working out your destiny and having some sense prophetically of what God's saying about the future so that you can make it correctly through the present and be disciplined and pay your dues and do all that, but knowing that God's taking you to something bigger than what you're currently experiencing is this idea that God's faithful always to bless things and bring increase. The parable of the talents, right? Remember the parable of talents? He gave one got one got two, one got five. I forget the numbers, but I think it's like that. And one of them took the one that he had, and because he was afraid that the master was a hard taskmaster, he took that one and hid it. And Jesus said that one, got in trouble, right? But the other ones, what did they do? They invested it, and they brought increase. So no matter where you look in Scripture, there's always increase. How about our church? I used to pastor a church much smaller than this in town, and this was not uncommon. This would be once every 6 weeks, 2 months, I would have this comment. Oh, this is over a 7-year period or so. Someone would come to church, and they would be new, so I would go over and greet them. Welcome, glad you're here, tell me your name, start talking to them. And then they would say this. This was a repeated theme over 6-7 year period. They would say, man, we're new in town and we're looking for a church, and we went to all the big churches in town. I don't know what they meant by that. But we went to all the larger churches, and we like this church because it's small. Now, I understand that if you've grown up in a smaller country church or small, you feel more comfortable where there's not 700. I used to go to a church that had 10,000 members, and so I know what it's like to walk into an auditorium that seats more people than live in my hometown, which that was true at that church in San Antonio. But I understood the sentiment. But after a while, there was a part of that I refused to accept. And so I learned a response. Now, as a pastor, you can't tell, hey, dummy, I disagree with you, because that's not the way you grow churches or reach people. But here's my response. I would say, man, I'm glad that you feel led here, and I'm glad that our size is appealing to you, but I just want to tell you something. We have no intentions of staying small. And just let that hang. I'm like, if you're here because we're small, you might be here for the wrong reason. You might want to be here because we preach the gospel, or because your heart connects to the vision of the church, and that sort of thing, not because of the physical size or the number of people in the room. You know what I mean? And so listen, what about our church? What do we dream of? What is possible? But increase is definitely a part of that. And then number 3 is this: the spirit of prophecy breaks the yoke of our burdens. Did you see that? He breaks the yoke. I want to remind you today, as clearly as I can, that whatever it is in your life that keeps you up at night, whatever it is at night that's, in your life that's trying to give you ulcers, that you worry about, that you carry it around. I mean, the picture here is a yoke of burden, like the device you put on an oxen to make him work. You yoke him up like he's got his shoulders down. That's the picture, right? And man, you see people, right, that are burdened sometimes. I talk to people all the time that carry tremendous burdens. I carry my own burdens sometimes, right? And so I want to remind you today, in that context, that God sees your burden. He knows where you're burdened. I mean, Jesus said, take my yoke upon you. For my yoke is easy, my load is light. And I just want to remind you that He sees your burden. But sometimes I think we have a hard time with getting unburdened. I thought this was funny, an article about a company years ago. This was in Reader's Digest a few years back. And this company decided that they wanted to make things a little more free and relaxed in the company, so they instituted Casual Fridays. Casual Fridays are a good idea, I think. I think Casual Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays is pretty good too. So here are the memos. Memo number 1, effective immediately, the company is adopting Casual Fridays so that employees may express their diversity. Memo number 2, spandex and leather micro miniskirts are not appropriate attire for Casual Fridays. Neither are string ties, rodeo belt buckles, or moccasins. Memo number 3, Casual Day refers to dress only, not your attitude. When planning Friday's wardrobe, remember image is the key to our success. Memo 4, a seminar on how to dress for Casual Friday will be held this Friday in the cafeteria. A fashion show will follow, and attendance is mandatory. Memo number 5, this is a fun progression. As an outgrowth of Friday's seminar, a 14-member Casual Day task force has been appointed. The word task force just doesn't seem casual to me. Has been appointed to prepare guidelines for proper dress on Casual Fridays. Memo number 6, the Casual Day Task Force has completed a 30-page manual. A copy of Relaxing Dress Without Relaxing Company Standards has been mailed to each employee. Please review the chapter, You Are What You Wear, and consult the Home Casual versus Business Casual checklist. If you have any doubts, please see a member of the task force before work on Friday mornings. Memo number 7, wonder why right here. Because of the lack of participation, Casual Friday has been discontinued, effective immediately. Sometimes when we're trying to get unburdened, we end up having more burdens on, right? I want to remind you that God wants you to be free, that He sees your burdens, and He doesn't need to complicate it or write a manual or do 15 steps to get you uncomplicated. Yokes come in different forms. If you watch the movie Shawshank Redemption, which is one of the most popular movies of all time, you will recognize the scene at the end when Red, played by Morgan Freeman, it's one of my favorite movies, and he had, in a rage, killed someone when he was a young man and spent his life in prison. So some 40, 50 years later, as an old man, he's released. He's sacking groceries. He's living in some kind of little halfway house hotel thing. It's not good. And part of the dialogue of him doing this, he just says, it is a terrible thing to live in fear. Because what was true for Red in that movie was this, was he was no longer living in the physical confines of Shawshank Prison, but he was still a prisoner. He was still burdened, right? And you may remember that his friend Andy Dufresne, played by Timothy Robbins, had told him the night before he escapes, he said, there's this place in this hayfield out in this little town out in Maine, and he reminds him where to go, and he goes and he digs up under this rock and he finds a little box. He opens it up and there's money in there, a lot of money, and then there's a note from his friend Andy Dufresne, and he says this, Red, if you've come this far, then maybe you're willing to come a little further. I want to say to you today that there are times when to get unburdened and really live in the freedom that Jesus spoke of and was spoken of about Him 700 years before He was born, is that we may have to go a little farther. We may have to come one more time to unload our burdens. Our normal routine of depending on God may take one more step. But when we do that, we can live, I think, what it says in Galatians chapter 5, that it is for freedom that Christ is free. Why did Jesus set you free? For the sake of freedom itself. Isn't that great? It's for freedom that you were set free. And then it says, stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. In another translation, if Christ has truly set us free, make sure that you stay free and don't get tied up again. So let's remember the spirit of the prophet. I pray that for all of us, that we would have those things in our hearts and in our lives where we're living in the present, we're having to pay the dues, we're having to hunker down and pay the bills and be disciplined and deal with things now that we don't want to live with forever, but we have something in our hearts and minds that we know out in the future, we know God is planning on doing something different. Why don't you stand together and I'll pray for you and we'll close in a song.